35,000 Israelis took to the streets of Tel Aviv to protest their government policies. Their main target, the prime minister. Participants of the march calling on Israeli authorities to refocus on domestic issues like health, education, housing, and salaries. They're calling on Israel to change its strategy on security and foreign policy. The rally, dubbed Israel Wants Change, is being held a week away from the general election that could land Benjamin Netanyahu a fourth term in office.
Well, there you have the Russian television version of some events that took place in Tel Aviv over the weekend. Joining us here to continue our conversation right now is NBC contributor and New York Times bestselling author Carol Roth. And also with us is the senior political analyst at the Washington Examiner. A pleasure to have Michael Barone back with us here at MidPoint as well. Michael, thanks for joining the conversation.
Thank you.
All right, so we see these protests in Israel, anti-Netanyahu protests. Could this potentially doom his upcoming election here, Michael?
I don't think it necessarily dooms his upcoming election. It's a sign that we're in a political campaign. My understanding of Israeli politics is that a rally of 35,000 people in Tel Aviv is actually not as large as you often see in protest rallies in Israel. You've got Tel Aviv as a metropolitan area of several million, and it's indicative that there's opposition to Netanyahu, something we know from Israeli polling, but it's not indication that there's overwhelming opposition. And it seems like, from your description, that a lot of the opposition is based more on opposition to Netanyahu's relatively free market economic policies as it is to his positions on foreign policy.
Yeah, and Carol, we're playing that clip from Russian television, so we got to kind of view everything as it would be viewed through their lens. But, you know, Netanyahu is in a closer election than he would like. You know, now that it's been a little bit of time since he gave that address before Congress, what's your take on how this election is going to play out, not just for him, but also for the Likud party?
Well, all I know is that if he doesn't get reelected, I'd like to bring him over here because I thought he was fantastic. But I do have a lot of friends who are in Israel, and you know, the overwhelming number of Israelis are in the center, not in the right and the left, which is sort of the same situation as
sounds familiar.
Here in America.
Yeah, sounds very familiar.
So, you know, the thing is, I do think there are a lot of people who don't think that he is the best choice, but given the choices that they have, I do think that there is a very good likelihood that he gets reelected. Again, very much a mirror of what happens right here in our country, where we're given these choices and most of the country is somewhere in the middle, and that's the exact same thing that's happening in Israel.
Well, Michael, I want to talk about the Bob Menendez situation with you as well. These reports came down Friday that he was going to be charged in relation to what he may or may not have done with his seat on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. We also have talked about this in relation to Bob Menendez's lack of support for the president of his party. Do you think there's any way that the two are tied?
Well, I think there's a lot of suspicion on the part of both some Democrats and some Republicans that the timing of this news is not entirely coincidental. Bob Menendez has been strongly critical of the president's foreign policy with respect to Iran and the negotiations there. He's been very critical of the opening towards the Castro brothers' dictatorship in Cuba. And we know at the same time that these charges have had some airing for a period of about 2 years. So it raises the question in the mind of a lot of politicians. Why now?
Yeah, I was thinking the same exact thing. Why now? Carol, do you think Bob Menendez is a patsy?
He could be. I do think it's very cliche that somebody from either Illinois or New Jersey, where Bob Menendez is from, you know, would be potentially in some sort of trouble of this magnitude. Being from Illinois myself, it really is become a very sad cliche. But I do find that regardless of what the situation is, that the timing is very suspicious. And I don't like the fact that we elect people to represent us and that there is any sort of overtone of targeting, especially if they're being critical against the president, which is exactly what they should be doing, again, in that whole scheme of checks and balances. So I do think, like you said, this could be patsy time.
All right, we'll see what happens with that. More to come, I'm sure. I also want to talk to you both about immigration reform. This time last week, we were in a repeat a deadline, a crisis on the horizon regarding the funding for the Department of Homeland Security. But Michael, Republicans did not really get anything in return for trying to hold the line and pull tight the purse strings against the president. Was this a failure from the party leadership? Was this an ill-advised mission from the get-go? What's your take on where we stand right now on immigration reform?
Well, my understanding is that the House took a stand, the House Republicans, with the leadership going along with the complaint of many conservatives that they wanted to overrule by depriving funding not only for the order that the president issued last November, I believe, legalizing something like 4 million immigrants, but also going back to the June 2012 so-called Dreamers order, which was much more popular. And I think that that reduced the chance that they would get any support from Democrats in the Senate, which they needed to get the issue on the floor, because the 2012 order had something like 64% support in public opinion polls, widely favored. The November order much less. So the conservatives that in the House got the Republicans to take a stand which was arguably legally consistent, because they believe both orders were violations of the president's duty to take care to execute the laws faithfully, but politically very different.
Yeah, Carol, we've got a minute left to go. I just want to get your take because, some could make the argument saying, look, the courts are working. The president's order has been stopped for now. Maybe we should just let that play itself out.
Well, as somebody who's not a fan of politics as a sport, I do like the idea that we vote on issues based on those issues and we don't try to tie them out into other things. So the fact that we're funding the government really shouldn't be related to immigration in any way. What I do hope happens, though, is that they come back with some real immigration reform and address that on a standalone basis. And perhaps they cannot go as far back as Michael was alluding to, but that they do come up with some of the reforms that are so desperately needed in and around immigration, but on a standalone basis, so we can debate the merits of that in and of itself and not punish, other parts of the country because of that.
Well, let's see what happens. We've been waiting a long time for movement on immigration reform. It's only made it out of the Senate thus far. Michael Barone, Carol Roth, thank you so much both for being with us. Interesting take from both of you.
Thanks, John.
All right, much more to come here on MidPoint. We're going to talk more about the situation involving this bullet ban. You may have heard of these green bullets, AK-47 or AR-15, I should say, rounds. But it doesn't have anything to do with the environment. It has to do with your freedom. We're going to take a closer look at that in just a moment. Right after this Newsmax Now update.